Good morning, everybody. Perfect, thank you. They're closing the doors, so that's clearly a cue, a sign to get going. Welcome to the first of 3 sessions focusing on Tier 2. I'm Tim Lewis, professor at University of Missouri, and also have been part of the PBIS Center since day one. Been here for 25 years. Presenting with me is my colleague and good friend Allison Brune from University of Iowa. I'll let her introduce herself when she gets up to speed. The goal of this morning is to give you a lot of information in a short amount of time to kind of set up then the rest of the strand. Just real quickly, how many of you are currently implementing Tier 2 or beginning to implement Tier 2? Okay, great. How many of you still at Tier 1 but kind of looking down the track, thinking ahead? All right, it's a big room, but if there are questions, comments, please put your hand up. We'd love to have a conversation with you as we go. Allison did a great job and prompted me along and got the slides up, so they're there. I'm not sure where they are, but somehow you can get them from the app. In addition, all of these things will be posted at pbis.org. So give our web person a little bit of grace, but usually they're pretty quick. Within a couple weeks after the forum, they have all of the updated PowerPoints and presentations there. All right. You've probably seen this slide already, kind of that prompt about when working in your team. In other words, it's sort of a good prereq for all of us to think about as this session goes on. How do we compare to priorities? Who's going to oversee this? What should we stop doing? That's always the million-dollar question, right? It's one of my favorite when I talk to schools. You know, one of the things we do early on in the process is we have this work smarter, not harder. And we say, okay, list every committee or every initiative that somehow is related to climate or behavior. You know, and there'll be 39 on this list. And I'll ask teachers, like, well, tell me about this one. Oh, yeah, it does work. Oh, it's never worked. It's like, why do you do it? Because we've always done it. It's like, stop. You don't have the minutes to keep doing things that aren't going to lead to those critical outcomes that you identify as priorities. Real quickly then, as I said, this is sort of a mini strand. We don't have the 4 sessions. We've condensed it into 3. So it's going to be sort of action-packed. So right after Alice and I present, our colleagues are going to walk you through check and check out. And looking at check and check out adaptations from preschool through high school. Most of the check and check out research and work initially was at the elementary, maybe pushing into middle school age, but Angus in particular and Sarah both work in high schools, and they're going to talk a little about adaptations. And then we've got Erin Campbell and Mary Rose are going to talk about building in cultural competencies. Now I know in some of your states you're not allowed to talk about equity and race and culture and so forth. Well, don't talk about it, just do it, right? Just implement those adaptations. Thanks. But Erin's going to kind of walk you through, and Mary Rose, about some of their work. Erin in particular is interested in African-American boys at the elementary level and how we build in some of those competencies to increase the likelihood those young people are successful, as well as all kids. So the objectives you've got already in your handout there. All right, anytime I talk to educators, I show this slide. If you ever heard me speak in the last 15 years, you've seen this slide. And I point out all the time, look, I can't make kids behave. No one in this room can make kids behave. If you go in it with the mindset that you're going to make them behave, you're going to lose, right? You might win little battles along the way, but you're going to lose the war. The good news is, as educators, we can create environments to increase the likelihood. And what we know now from 25 plus years of research, environments that increase the likelihood are guided by a core curriculum and implement with consistency and fidelity. A main theme across this forum, that F word, the fidelity. If we're not implementing those essential features at the level we know is necessary to impact kid behavior, don't be surprised if we don't get the outcomes. It's really essential as we start moving up that continuum and putting in Tier 2 and Tier 3. You've all probably experienced, Tier 1 universals is relatively low risk. You change things in the cafeteria. Nobody gets upset about it, right? You change things on the playground, or you change things during passing time. It's sort of low risk because, remember, you've got those 80% of kids in your back pocket who already are coming to school with those skills and the ability to sort of learn and quickly adapt to what our new routines, procedures, expectations are. But when you start moving up the continuum, it gets a little riskier. Because unfortunately, nobody here, of course, but you've got colleagues back home that are just waiting for this to fail and say, oh, see, I told you it doesn't work. So when you start moving into tier 2 and tier 3, the stakes get a little higher because people are expecting you to, quote unquote, fix these kids. One of the themes you want to keep bringing back to your colleagues is we can't make them learn. We can't make them behave. PBIS, school-wide PBS, MTSS, MTSB, EIEIO, doesn't matter what you call it. It's about those essential features. It's all about changing the environment, putting in more and more supports in the environment to increase the likelihood kids learn, increase the likelihood kids manifest good social, emotional, behavioral skill sets. All right, we're doing some tech adjusting here. And apologies for the subtitles, closed captioning. Somebody asked to do that, and so we're all trying to do it, but unfortunately relies on the network, and so everybody's hitting it, so it comes and goes. So again, I apologize for those relying on this. So at the school-wide, you know these are essential features. We know we have to have our clear expectations. You develop that matrix, you teach and practice, you encourage behavior. You also think about how you're going to discourage problem behavior. You've got database decision making, and you're starting to gauge your family and communities. Universals, key and essential. The degree to which we're successful at tier 2, tier 3 is the degree to which we've got good, solid foundations. So one of the definite bits of advice we'd give you is don't go too quickly. When we first started this work, before PBS, it was called EBS, because we had a grant called Effective Behavior Support. And we would come and train schools in the fall on tier 1, and then we'd come in the winter and do tier 2, and then in the spring we'd do tier 3. And you, as you might imagine, we've learned a lot of things along the way, like don't do that. That's a really bad professional learning model because it fails miserably. Make sure that you continue to revisit your universals. You are never finished with universals. They always need to be a priority in the work you do. Tier 2, here's the essential features kind of in a nutshell. First and foremost, we want quick, efficient ways to identify these kids. Sooner rather than later is better. We want to get kids at least to the table to discuss them at the first signs of non-response to those universals. So the first question is, do we have universals in place? Do we have them with enough intensity? If the answer is yes, and kids are still not being successful, still displaying some challenging behavior, then we bring them to the table and have a conversation. I know Allison's going to go into more detail about some of these pieces, so my job is just the setup guy, and then I get to sit down and you get to hear from her. We tend to look at sort of 3 kind of ways to identify kids. More and more schools are doing universal screening. Now I know some of your states, you're not allowed to do that without parent consent. Anybody from Kansas? Nobody from Kansas? Oh, a couple of people from Kansas. They passed a law, don't know why. You've got to get parent consent anytime you gather any measure on kids. So you might imagine that kind of hamstring people. But screening isn't just that standardized scale. We look at a lot of different data sources to screen. We create data decision rules, such as 2 majors or 2 minors. We bring the kid to the table, we have a conversation. And always we have the option for teacher referral. Because in addition to kind of those acting out non-compliant in your face kids, we also want to try to gather up those kids that are more than internalizing in. Kids who are sort of manifesting anxiety, depression, social isolation, and so forth. So we look at 3 different ways, typically at tier 2. We do a very informal process. This isn't like complex data analysis. We look at the kid and we match the kid to a possible intervention. We recommend you limit your tier 2 to these 3 things. First, provide additional social skills. You've got your universals, you've got your matrix, you're teaching those, but some kids need a little more practice. I always draw parallels to academics. And when I talk to classroom teachers, you've taught the lesson, you're a math teacher, most kids are diving in, they're doing the math work, but you got those 1 or 2 kids that are looking at you like, what? And you have to go over, you got to give a prompt, you got to give a couple examples, and like, oh, okay, I got it. Same on that social emotional behavior side. Some of these kids need a little more practice with the skills, or they need a little more, not highly individualized, but a little more individualization. meaning I need skills specific to my anger management, or I need skills specific to resolving conflict, right? Second, self-management. Check in, check out, check and connect. There's several great programs out there, all with a lot of research to support their use. Once again, implemented with Fidelity. And then third, academic supports. A whole lot of kids will come to your attention for social emotional behavior concerns, but you drill down and it's an academic issue. They're 3 grade levels below. Makes sense they're acting out in that US history class because they can't read the content. We find that pretty much meets 99.9% of kids' need. Additional social skills, some self-management, self-monitoring, or academic. As always, we got a progress monitor, and very, very bright red, they have to be linked to those universals. We've done parallel play for a long time in education, where some kids go to the counselor, and some kids get this, and some kids get that, and nobody knows what they do there. Key to all of these is linking back to your universals. So even if you adopt check and check out, the first thing that you need to do is to make sure on those daily behavior reports, they match your set of school-wide expectations. You can add both externalizing and internalizing additional components within that as well. Now, people always want to know, when are we ready to go to Tier 2? And I always point out, data determine when you're ready. Not the calendar or not a professional opportunity. We've got to, in essence, make sure we're looking at and meeting those readiness factors. So what are the readiness factors for Tier 2? One, I've already said this many, many times, you're implementing universals with Fidelity. You've got school-wide, you've got non-classroom, and in particular, you've got classroom. Another lesson we've learned is do not proceed into Tier 2 until you have some way to systemically support all teachers in your school. If teachers are still struggling, check and check out is not going to help that individual. Small group social skills are not going to help that individual if they go back into that room and that teacher is still struggling to manage and to instruct those kids. We look at actual outcomes. So TFI scores 70% or higher. If you're still doing the SET or the BOQ, that's 80%. And then the self-assessment survey, about 80% of the staff say, yep, we're doing these things. In addition, we want to look at kid outcomes. You all know the triangle, and I haven't shown a triangle or circles yet. I'm getting a little edgy, a little nervous, but I think I can do it. I'm going to show you a quasi-triangle in a minute. But your data indicate about 80% of kids are responding to universals, that 0 to 1 major office referrals, right? We're consistently using data to make decisions, and we've got systems in place, especially to gather classroom minors. A lot of classroom teachers in here, right? You all have had that kid, or you have that kid that pushes it every day, but they know exactly where the line is and they never cross it. So nobody else in that building knows about that kid, i.e. they've never been to the office, but you're managing and dealing with behaviors on a daily basis. We want to make sure we gather and capture that information because that's going to help us, again, sooner rather than later, and it's going to help us decide which Tier 2 support might be most appropriate for that young person. Let me give you an example. This is an elementary school that I worked with a number of years ago, and they had, I think, 90% on the set. They're implementing with high fidelity. The staff are like, we need Tier 2, we need Tier 2. And the assistant principal said, hold on, this is the end of the school year. Here's our data. We had 1,712 office referrals that I had to intervene with. We had 57 kids with 9 or more. What these data say is if you go to Tier 2 or Tier 3, it will implode. There's too many kids. The system isn't set up to handle that number of kiddos. What these data indicate, and we see this all the time with a lot of our schools, is that yes, they're implementing with fidelity, but not enough intensity. And by intensity, I mean frequency or duration of those teaching pieces, higher rates of positive specific feedback, and so forth. And so what did they do? They went back to data, and they looked at why kids were being sent out. They surveyed teachers, and what they found is that most of them came during this literacy block. What unfortunately had happened in this building is they had a lot of assistants, a lot of instructional aides and paraprofessionals, and they lost them. So teachers are trying to differentiate reading instruction within their classroom. So I'm sitting at the U table with 4 or 5 kids, and I've got some kids over here supposed to be doing peer work, and some kids over here doing independent work. But what I'm really doing is yelling at everybody because nobody is doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they all acknowledge. So they went back and they said, okay, what are the routines and procedures? Teach and practice. Let's put these supports in place. Can we rethink maybe some of our resources in terms of staffing and supporting smaller groups of kids? Taught and practice, here's what happened. 1 school year later, down from 57 to 16, down from 1,700 to 516. Now, if you look at their distributions, 83, 10, and 7, that's manageable. They can manage that number of kids at Tier 2. In other words, you've got to ramp up that intensity if your data are showing that, yes, we're doing Fidelity, but we're not getting the kid outcomes. People always want to know, it's like, okay, what do you mean about sort of this intensity? And one of the things that I did, again, just real quickly, as an illustration, anybody ever read this book? It's a great book, Meaningful Differences. Betty Hart and Todd Risley were researchers in the Kansas City area, and they were interested in early language experience of kids, when they're first learning to talk, 11 months, 18 months, and then they followed these kids into adulthood. So they found African-American and white families at poverty, kind of working class, and upper class or professional homes. And they just went into these homes and watched primary caregiver, mostly mom, interact with the kid, and they counted everything they did, and then they followed these kids into adulthood. Well, surprise, surprise, has nothing to do with the color of your skin, but a whole lot to do with how much money's in that home. We know that poverty is so linked to so many other risk factors. But the really cool thing that Betty Hart and Todd Risley did is they projected out what it would take to get kids in poverty caught up. So they built this scenario saying, okay, if I could get a child at 3 years old, and I want to catch them up to what a working class child's experienced, it will take over 40 hours per week of intensive language experience. It will take 1,100 instances of affirmative feedback just to get that kid caught up with what a working class child's heard. Those numbers are just sort of staggering, but it makes sense. If you work with kids in poverty, you've experienced this. You try to give them a compliment, they recoil. They don't have a learning history with it, but you get in their face like, oh, I know this dance. Oh, you're going to lead this time? That's great. Okay, here we go. It's familiar to them. The point being, look at your data, yes, Fidelity, but we're not getting the kid outcomes. You might have to intensify or do some really strategic problem solving in and around some of those trouble areas. Other things around readiness for Tier 2. We started, kind of went universals right into Tier 2. And we didn't pay much attention to classrooms. And since then, this actually, particularly in Missouri and some of the other states I work with, this is a prerequisite. If you don't have some sort of systemic way to support teachers, you're not ready for Tier 2. I mean, again, think about something as simple as check in, check out, where the kids come in and teachers got to prompt, and then teachers got to debrief and the kid, give feedback. That requires a pretty well-run, efficient classroom. And if that's not happening, it's not going to go very far. If you think about, and there's a classroom strand was yesterday, hopefully some of you got to experience that. If not, go download those slides. Look at those presentations. My crew at MU went through all the research, and they basically said, look, these are 8 essential that have strong evidence. These are those high leverage practices that we talk about. And so what we do is we make sure every classroom teacher feels he or she implementing all of these 8 consistently and with fidelity. The challenge is, how do we make sure that happens? So one of the things that we've done is, first, you've got lots of resources. What we have done, because you told us, is, I asked teachers one time, it's like, how best can we support you around classroom supports? And the answer was, well, I need it when I need it. I'm like, what does that mean? It's like, well, I don't want to go to a 3-day workshop before school starts. It's like when I've tried everything I know what to do and it's not working, that's when I need support around classrooms. And so what we have done is we've gotten away from day-long workshops because nobody has that luxury anymore. The fact that you guys are all here is pretty exciting. A lot of districts and states I'm in are still struggling with those critical shortages. All right, you can't leave the building because there's nobody there to teach the kids. On our Missouri website, you can download what we call mini modules. So here's what we do. we start with data, so we have everybody self-assess anonymously, and then we pick one skill, right, from that list of 8, opportunities to respond. Then we as an entire school just work on that one skill for a quarter, for a semester. I've had schools work an entire school year just on that one skill. So you can download the mini modules, and there's tip sheets and activities, 10, 15 minutes. That's it. During a faculty meeting, you do a 10, 15-minute brief professional development on opportunities to respond. Then we focus and practice. Now, just like the kids, one of those essential features, high rates of positive specific feedback, we also need feedback to master our own learning. You probably may have seen this work from Joyce and Showers. If you guys retain, 5% of what Allison and I talk about today, it's been a good day, right? I always point out, the forum conferences, I am violating everything I know about good instruction. I'm violating every principle. You're sitting there passively, right? I'm expecting you to acquire the information to the point of fluency to generalize and maintain when you go back home. I know that's not possible. The good news with forum is it's a great opportunity to get a lot of good information and then go back and unpack and then embed these within your systems. However, if we add coaching, simple performance feedback, look at skill mastery and use, upwards of 95%. We build fluency. So as I said, we got these brief in service. That's easy. Then what we do is we practice with feedback, just like the kids. And we've tried all sorts of different variations. We're doing lots of different research. Here's a little app that our colleague Terry Scott had some developers. We had principal walkthroughs, right? So opportunities to respond. I'm supposed to come to your classroom. I pull up this app, tap, tap, tap. I count the number of opportunities to respond, and I email it to you. I'm a huge fan, and what most of our schools are doing is peer coaching. So Alice and I are both 10th grade history teachers. We get along okay. I find 10 minutes I can go watch her, and I go in there and I just count the number of opportunities to respond I see her give. And I put that data on her desk and I leave. We don't meet, I don't write a plan up, I don't evaluate, and then she finds 10 minutes to come in and count mine. And I'm like, ooh, I'm really low. I go back to that one page I got at the professional learning. It's like, oh, dry erase boards, that might work great. I can quiz kids on dates. It's like, okay, what year did the Civil War start? And everybody writes it and they hold it up. I'm increasing my opportunities to respond. You've got to have that performance feedback. Now, we create all sorts of rules. You, classroom teacher, are the only one that owns the data, unless it's been de-identified and we're looking at the school. It is never part of your annual evaluation. It is never part of any decisions other than how do we build and increase our own fluency. So thinking about Tier 2, entry point, sooner rather than later. Thinking about Tier 2, limit yourself to a number of practices. In fact, our recommendation is always just start with one. Start with check and check out. Start with just 5 kids. Trial it to work the bugs out. And then layer in more, add more kids, and so forth. Readiness is key. Even if you put your hand up that you're going down the Tier 2 road, maybe do a little back checking about the universals, particularly that classroom piece. Because where I've seen our Tier 2 supports fail, again, and this is not pointing fingers or blaming, but I see it fail at the classroom level. We had a junior high one time, and we're doing check and check out, and we noticed this kid's data didn't go down, it spiked. And we couldn't figure out what's going on. And so we talked to him, and we pulled up all of his daily progress reports, and what the teacher was doing was writing snarky notes on his reports. Like, well, I'm gonna give you 2, but I didn't like your attitude today. You better shape up, young man. It's like, well, I wouldn't want to hand that to a teacher as well, right? So he started acting up, so he got kicked out. Thinking about those readiness piece, you always have to do universals. You're always looking at data. Match the intensity of your universals to the learning history of the children and youth you serve. Support each other. As I said, it's not blaming. I talk all the time with districts and states. If a teacher's struggling, that's not that teacher's fault. That's that school and district's fault. The school and district can do something to help that teacher be successful. And we know it's only going to get worse, right? I'm, one of these guys thinking serious about retirement. all of us boomers, as you like to call us, some of you young people, we're all retiring and leaving huge gaps in education. And we're not hiring enough, we're not finding enough young people to fill those. You had a question, please. Yes, my advice is a do-over. You know, and one of the things that I always find puzzling is people like, oh, we've got to wait till next semester. No, you can do a do-over next Thursday at 2:15 p.m. From this point forward, here are new expectations, here are the new social skill lessons, here's the new schedule where we're going to explicitly teach our universals, here's where, and just look forward, do that TFI, because it will show you where your gaps are in your universals. And I'm going to predict the gaps are around decision-making and classroom responses to allow instruction to go, to continue. So if you're noticing that our Tier 2 is not working as well, or there's too many kids, right? Statistically, yes, we know that more and more kids are struggling, but statistically, you don't want half of your building in Tier 2. That says your Tier 1 isn't in place with the intensity. So just go back, look at the data, look at the TFI, do the self-assessment, and then just start picking off one or two of those critical pieces to kind of sort of smooth over and continue to build those strong universals. Great question. So our other question was, so first question I forgot, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to repeat, that they've got Tier 2 going, but Tier 1's not in place and it's kind of a mess and there's a lot of kids in Tier 2. And so that was my response about start over. But then the other question is, okay, do we stop doing Tier 2? The teachers probably aren't going to be happy with that. I'm glad you guys found that humorous. So my recommendation is continue the kids that are currently being served, really go back, beef up those universals, beef up those classroom supports, and then kind of re-examine and sort of start anew with kind of like the next cohort. And continue to tell your colleagues, like, look, we get it. We're going to continue, but we've got to build some of these foundational pieces. We've got to shore them up. Otherwise, the kids are going to overwhelm our system. Great questions. All right, Allison. More questions you can answer.
Can we go back to it?
I have a question on kind of the data part of it. Like you mentioned the terms like, yes, you do the screening, yes, you do help
Yeah.
determine, but is there like a general rule of thumb, like you talked about ODRs, but like especially
Yep.
as they get towards like preschool, kindergarten, first grade, it might not be an ODRs that would necessarily trigger
Right.
the need for Tier 2. So what are the recommended data decision rules around younger children?
Yeah. Yeah. So a great question about data, particularly younger kids, preschool kids. When I talk about screening, I'm not just talking about scale. Attendance, nurse visits. At the preschool level, I work in early childhood where they do collect actually kind of classroom minors. But we tend to be a little more informal. And so at the preschool level, for most of the schools that we're working in, they tend to rely on a teacher referral. But you give your colleagues, here's what we're looking for. Because the other thing that you guys have to keep sort of pushing on is you can't put your heavy hitters in check and check out. Right? And that's what teachers want to do. They want to put these really tough kids. Oh, that's great, you're doing, put them in there. It's like, no. Maybe if that young person has an individual plan or they're on an IEP, it's real appropriate to maybe put them in a Tier 2 as kind of a maintenance piece. And I've worked with schools that do that. So we kind of get those individual plans, we're getting some of the things under control, and we sort of put them in Tier 2 as a way to kind of start gently backing out. It's just, you know, it's just a way to kind of maintain that. Yeah. There was one more question and then, yeah. Please.
I just wanted to know if you had talking points on how to get your admin to believe you when you're saying, like, the Tier 1 needs to be.
So her question was, do I have talking points to convince admins that Tier 1 always needs lots of attention and nurturing? Yeah, I would go to the website, get the implementer's blueprint, even pull out the Tier 2 material, and part of the readiness, it will be very plainly stated, you have to have Tier 1 with Fidelity for your Tier 2 to be successful. So you can kind of use those as, like, I'm not saying it, you know. I got it off the website, so it must be true.
Tim Lewis said it. I'll
Yeah.
get you his cell phone number. We'll get it on there.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
It's okay.
We'll keep moving on. These are great questions. And I apologize because I have to run right after this because I got another session. But you can hang around for a while.
I'll stay here.
So Allison will hang around for a while. And then as always, email if you got to follow up later on. So,
Okay.
please.
And he went 15 minutes over his time limit. So I'm going to talk about circles, and I might be talking in circles because I'm going to try to do this really quickly. He showed you triangles. I got the circles. So my piece of this is to give you a broad overview now that he's covered readiness and classroom systems. What does it actually look like when we're implementing, and what are the things that are required? And so we spend a lot of time on practices, and while those practices are important, I really firmly believe in the systems piece is what make the practices go. And so those are the things that really support the work that we do. In Tier 1, it's pretty clear with systems, you know, what the leadership team looks like, what the practices are, and the data that we're collecting. In the Tier 2, a lot of those remain the same, sort of theoretically, but they might look a little bit different. And so I want to talk about the role of teaming, resources, and professional development in the systems that are going to support the practices that you're implementing. So, is this stop working? Okay, so the first piece is the teaming. So who is on your Tier 2 team? And ideally, you have people who have behavioral expertise. You might even have people with mental health expertise. These people would have knowledge of students and administrative authority to make decisions. So there's going to be a variety of stakeholders that are involved in your Tier 2 team, just like in your Tier 1 team. So often we get questions about, well, should this be a standalone team? Should it be combined? And honestly, I've seen it done lots of different ways. So you could have a Tier 2 team by themselves. They can be combined with Tier 3. Should it be just behavior and just academics, or should it be combined? I'm sort of in the camp of it should be combined because you're looking at multiple data sources, and often kids you'll see struggling in both areas. And so being able to be at the table together is helpful. And then I think in high school we see more grade level teams. I don't think that there is like one standard way to do it. You do what works best for your school. But within those teams, we have to have really good procedures, just like we do with the practices that we're implementing. And so ideally, these teams would meet at least monthly. There'd be defined roles. There's lots of documentation in terms of what you're doing at the meeting and what you're going to be doing outside of the meeting. Within the meeting, that structure should really center on reviewing the data and identifying the students who need those supports, and then matching students to the interventions that they need, and we'll talk about what that looks like. And there are different ways to do this. So how many of you are familiar with TIPS, team intervention? Okay, yeah, so that's one sort of formalized process for running your teams. Other pieces of the system that are really, really important are the resources that you have available to you. So time, that's like the number one thing that all educators want more of, right? So in thinking about the time that it takes for team members to be a part of this team, you have to set aside that time. It has to be a priority from the school, from the administrator. Time from the interventionist. So if it's not a classroom intervention and students are leaving to go and do something, who are those people? What time do they have to do it? Do they have the training? Do they have the materials that they need? So sometimes, like if you're doing social skills instruction, you might have a manualized curriculum. So do you have the resources to afford that? If you're using reinforcers that cost money, again, you have to consider that kind of thing. The technology to support the implementation and the data collection systems and storage, and we'll talk more about the data systems in a little bit. Another really important component of Tier 2 is the professional development. And so this is the one that I think is really sort of interesting because there's so many different people involved in Tier 2, and not all of them have to know the same thing. So for check in, check out, you could literally have anybody in your building that is implementing that. And so my personal opinion is then everybody should be trained. Everybody should know what it means to deliver positive feedback, have that conversation, to fill out the form, all of those things, right? Whereas social skills instruction, if it's going to be a counselor, school psychologist, or social worker, those are the people that need to be trained in delivering that. However, if you want those skills to generalize to the classroom, there has to be time for educators to have conversations with the people who are delivering it so they can use the same terminology. They can learn to recognize when kids are displaying those social skills that they learned in their pull-out social skills instruction, and now they're using in the classroom or on the playground or in the lunchroom. And so it's really important to figure out who needs the training, what do they need, who should attend, what are the effective components. And, I've seen this done so many different ways. Some people, do in person. Now we're doing more hybrid, web-based training. But those are things to consider as you're developing the systems to support the practices. So we're going through this really, really quickly. As you've heard some of the things that you need to support Tier 2 implementation, I'm curious what you think the challenges are, the systems-based challenges to implementation and possible solutions. So now I'm going to try to use good practice and let you have time, like 1 minute for discussion with your neighbor, and then bring it back to whole group discussion. So just talk about the challenges with the systems piece. Okay, take about 10 seconds to wrap up your conversation. Five, 4, 3, 2. Thank you, Leanne Hawken. 1. Oh my gosh. I still got it as a teacher. Thank you for following that prompt. Awesome. Haven't been in the classroom for a while, so that felt good. Okay. Sorry. What do you see as the challenges to systems-based implementation? Anyone want to share? Leanne, back there.
So basically the questions and what I'm seeing out in schools when I'm observing is, so the TFI is awesome, but the TFI doesn't assess the extent to which classroom Tier 1 instruction is happening. And when I'm out in schools, the number one thing that's not happened is Tier 1 stuff in schools. So it's not sweet in the TFI. It's the teachers are actually not differentiating for the kids that really need it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're treating lots of kids as tier students. And what happens is there's most schools I'm in, they don't have a check on the classroom PBIS.
Yep.
They have a check on school-wide PBIS, but they don't have a classroom check.
Yep. That's a really good point. And when I tried to address in my grad program, but never mind. Conversation for another day.
Teacher vacancies.
Oh, yes. The attrition from the field right now is at a high. That's a problem. Yeah. Teacher buy-in, that's always a big one.
The system of time. So it's not, for us, like our PD is so scattered, and then we have our staff meetings outside hours, that even if we want to do it, the system in which we have the time to implement is so inconsistent and far apart that like things just don't stick, and so then it affects buy-in because it's too scattered.
Right, and it's just one more thing to do. Absolutely. Yes.
So she said buy-in, but I like to use the word investment. So it's actually the administration investment to ensure accountability of the stakeholders that are supposed to be implementing.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah.
Admin transiency to
Oh.
increase sustainability of Tier 1 to be able to even implement Tier 2.
Yeah. The administrator piece is so, so important. Absolutely. And I honestly, and Tim may disagree with me, but I feel like the schools that I've seen with the best implementation have the administrators who are in the arena. They're making time for people to do what they need to do, and they're a part of the process. Okay, so let's move from systems, we know how important that is, to practices. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on practices because we have other sessions that are going to dive into what those practices really are, but I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of Tier 2 practices, so the interventions that we put in place, how to match kids to effective interventions, and then how to make adaptations. So my question to you is, what Tier 2 interventions are you currently using in your school district? And raise your hand if you're using check in, check out. Okay, 100%. Good. Social skills instruction. Okay. Self-monitoring. Oh, a few of you. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. What am I missing? Mindfulness work. Okay. Small group problem solving, conflict resolution. Okay, yeah, lots. So see, there are lots of different things. But the key is that we don't want to take this one-size-fits-all approach. And I often think about this in sort of different realms. I am a softball coach of my kids, and so I think about when I have a pitcher who's not throwing strikes, what do? Do I automatically just yank them? No, I walk out to the pitcher's mound and I have a conversation. Are you okay? Do you feel okay? Are your legs tired? Is the umpire not calling strikes? Are things not working? You know, we have a conversation. I ask. I'm trying to gather more information. Same thing when I have a child who is coughing or sneezing. What am I gonna do? I'm gonna take their temperature. Do you have a fever? Does your stomach hurt? I'm trying to figure out what is the actual problem. Same thing when a child struggles academically. When we have a child who's identified for a Tier 2 intervention, we can't just say, okay, all of you are going to go do the same thing. Okay, we need to know a little bit more about what's going on. And in fact, the tiered fidelity inventory, how many of you guys use the TFI? Excellent. Okay, says if you're doing Tier 2 well, that you have multiple ongoing behavioral support interventions and they are matched to student need. Okay, so that is a big deal. Those practices have core characteristics no matter what it is. If it's check in, check out, if it's social skills instruction, if it's academic intervention, we know that they have to have certain things. They have to be readily available. So that's where that systems piece of training is really important, so that if they're readily available, the people that are implementing them are ready to go. So when we identify a kid who needs support within, 48, 72 hours, we should be able to have an intervention in place. And those interventions, as Tim said repeatedly, should align with Tier 1. The other piece is that because of the number of kids that we're going to be supporting in Tier 2, we have to be able to develop or deliver these in small groups of students. They have to require minimal commitment, resources, and changes in practice. So whatever we're doing should really fit well within the context that we've created in the classroom and the school overall. They should be easy to implement, and again, we have interventions that are matched and adapted to student need rather than sort of this one-size-fits-all approach. So different practices that we already covered, and you guys, it sounds like a lot of you are doing these different types of practices. I would, again, encourage you to go to the Tier 2 sessions that we have so that you can learn a little bit more about check in, check out, but then how to adapt that by age. As Tim said, Sarah and Angus have done a lot of work in high schools, and that's one area that we know is probably the most difficult, both as practitioners and as researchers. And then, again, the building cultural competency within small group social skills instruction. So beyond those Tier 2 practices and matching them, we can also adapt them. And so I like to think about adaptations as things that we can do either before we implement the intervention or during the intervention. And we're only going to adapt malleable features, so things that we can change without actually impacting the effects of the intervention. So there are core components of every intervention that have to be in place with Fidelity, and we're going to leave those in place. But what can we change on the front end just a little bit to make it more likely that kids are going to be successful? So things that we might look at, student level factors, so kind of, whether it's cultural or gender or interpersonal relationships, family things. So for example, if you have a kid who maybe has a really dysfunctional family and It's not a good idea to send the DPR home with check and check out because it's just going to cause issues at home. That's okay. We might be able to just not do that component. And I hate saying that, but all the research says that's the one that's implemented with the least fidelity, and we still get really good, impacts, right? Although I also hate saying that because we know that families are protective factors, right? So the more that we can involve them, the better. But you have to look at the individual scenarios. And then we also have contextual factors. So just within the school, are there things that we can do differently? So technology is a big one. I think Kent and others at Oregon have developed like an app for check in, check out, and that might be more palatable to a kid than to carry around, a clipboard or, with a sheet of paper. So those are things to consider. And then vertical adaptations, I'm going to talk a little bit more when we get to data, but that's how I think about what are we going to do during intervention. Intervention shouldn't look exactly the same for 8 to 12 weeks, okay? We need to look at how a student is responding based on their data, and then we're going to either intensify that intervention or we're going to fade that intervention. If you want to know more a little about those adaptations, some colleagues and I, Sarah McDaniel, Catherine Bradshaw, Lee Kern, and others did a special issue in the Journal of Applied School Psychology that looks at all these different ways to make adaptations. We look at it with social skills instruction, with check in, check out, et cetera. And if you write that down, you can also email me and I can send you the articles if you're interested in reading, and I'll give you my email at the end. Okay. So let's talk about data really quickly. So we have the systems to support the practices that we're implementing. How do we know if it's working? We're going to look at a couple different things. But before we implement, we want to make sure that we have matched kids effectively to intervention. And there are lots of different data sources that you can use to match kids. And ideally, you're looking at multiple data sources. So Tim talked a little bit about validated rating scales or screeners. I am unfortunately also in a state that has now required active parental consent, which again makes it difficult. We can look at office discipline referrals. We can do a brief FBA at Tier 2, and we can also look at academic measures. One of my favorite measures is the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, although I can tell you as a teacher I didn't actually love doing this as a universal screener because it took time. But now as I see the benefits of using this to match kids to intervention, I really, really love this tool. You can find this on sdqinfo.com. It used to be free, like the paper version is free, and now they're charging for the electronic version, of course. But it's fairly quick. It's 25 items. And the reason I like this, this tool is because it gives you information about risk in different categories. So it's going to tell you if a kid has risk for emotional symptoms, conduct problems, hyperactivity and inattention, peer problems, and it also gives you a strength in pro-social behavior. And so we can use that data to say, okay, this is a kid who's been identified that has conduct problems. They are going to be a good match for check in, check out because we know check in, check out has been shown to be effective for kids with that type of issue. Kids who struggle with hyperactivity and inattention, a more targeted self-monitoring intervention might be more appropriate in the specific class in which they're struggling. Kids who have emotional symptoms, so if they're struggling with some anxiety or depression, we're going to pick that up. Now, with the SDQ, you can do this universally. If you don't have a universal screener in place, once a kid has been identified for Tier 2, you could also just do it on the individual kids who are identified. So there are different ways to do that. Another good screener that gives you kind of categorized information is the SABRS. So that's going to tell you if kids struggle with social behavior, academic behavior, or emotional behavior, and we can match those categories to specific interventions for kids. We can also do it by function. So if you have data on your ODR form that lists like possible motivation, if you've done a brief FBA or used like the facts or something like that, we can look at that information and see, okay, kids who struggle with or really want to get adult attention, check in, check out might be really good. So that's sort of the list there. So there are different ways to do that matching piece, but it is about using your data wisely to give the kids what they need, because not all kids need the same thing, right? So a kid might be struggling academically in reading, and we don't give them a comprehension intervention if they can't first decode. It is the same thing with behavior. The other thing that we want to do with our data is to monitor progress. So we have a kid intervention, we've matched, we may have done some adaptations. We need to know if it's working. How do you know if a kid is responding to a tier 2 intervention? Well, we're going to monitor progress, and that's going to give us information about how they're growing, how they're progressing, and it's also going to give us information about the effectiveness of the intervention. There are several different ways to do this. There's resources available. These are a couple of articles that you can look up, and you should have it on your slides. And we can use different types of behavioral data. Direct behavior ratings are probably the easiest, I think. We can do systematic direct observation, which would be my preference, but it is also the most time and resource intensive, so it might be more difficult. And then intervention-based measures that are already sort of built into the intervention. The key is to understand if our data indicate that a student is responding. Now, the difficulty with behavior is there is no standard protocol or rules, right? So just like in check-in, check-out, we're not going to start everybody at an 80% goal. Okay? We're going to have to adjust based on what makes sense for the kid, right? And then we're going to have some rules in place. But the idea here is that we're going to be able to tell, is the behavior getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it stable? So we're going to do a little quiz and see how good you guys are at reading data. Okay? So here's a graph. We're looking at academic engagement. So is the kid on task doing what they're supposed to be doing? The first side is baseline. That means there's no intervention in place, okay? We just have tier 1, no tier 2, okay? Then that dotted line happens, we put a tier 2 intervention in place. Let's say it's self-monitoring. Raise your hand if you think that this intervention is working. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's not working. That's like 100% correct. You guys are awesome. Okay, let's look at this one. Same thing. Raise your hand if you think it's working. Excellent. It is. Now, the question is, we got one graph that says it's not working. We got another graph that says it is working. Okay, 2 different kids. Should we do the same thing for those kids? No. And often what we get is, oh, it's not working. Let's stop the intervention. Okay? We get, oh, it's working. Let's stop the intervention. The kid's cured. We can't do the same thing for responders and non-responders. That makes 0 sense. So what we need to do is have some decision rules in place about what we are going to do when we look at our behavioral data. And so that's really where your tier 2 team comes into play. They're going to create some decision rules to say, okay, when we see that a kid is making progress, so they've met their goal, 2 weeks straight or 4 out of 5 days for the last 2 weeks, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to begin to fade that intervention. Or they're not making their goal. They've missed their goal for 4 out of the last 5 days. We need to make an adaptation. We're going to have to either intensify that intervention, add another intervention in, or maybe they need a completely different intervention. We might need some more data. So here's an example of what that might look like. I'm going to skip through that because you guys can read it, and we don't have much time left. So the big thing here is, again, you can't do the same thing for responders and non-responders. So for non-responders, kids who aren't making progress, there are lots of different things you can do. You can lower the goal for that intervention. You can increase the frequency of the intervention. You can increase feedback. You can add reinforcement. You can add different components. That would be intensification. Conversely, we're going to actually do the opposite, right, for kids who are responding. So raising the goal, decreasing the frequency of the intervention, okay? Increasing the contingency, so changing the reinforcement. So we make it more difficult to access reinforcement because eventually we want to fade that out. So there are lots of different resources to look at. Sarah Strapola, who's doing the high school check and check out presentation next, wrote a great article on how to systematically fade tier 2 interventions. So we don't quit cold turkey, we do some fading. I got about 5 minutes left, and I want to talk now about my favorite topic. Tim says it's the F word. I also have a potty mouth, so I'm going to try not to say that. Treatment fidelity. So I like to think about fidelity as taking your medicine. Are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we following the label? So in medicine, like when you take medication and you read the label, it's matched to your need. Hopefully you're not taking medication for something you don't need, right? There might even be a picture, what it looks like. It's going to tell you how much and when to take it. There may even be an adaptation. For example, you need to take this one with food or you might vomit, right? So that kind of stuff is really important in medicine. If you are going to give yourself a chance to heal and get better, you have to take your medicine as prescribed. It is no different in education and implementing an evidence-based intervention. If we don't implement as prescribed and make adaptations accordingly that don't change the core components, we cannot expect results. It doesn't guarantee results, but it does give us information about whether or not this kid is making progress and the intervention is effective. And the reality is, students can't benefit from an intervention they never received. Just like you can't benefit from medicine you never took, right? So when I think about fidelity, I love this little chart and what fidelity data tell us about students' response to intervention. And so as a team, as a tier 2 team, we want to look at student data. Is the student responding to the intervention? If the answer is no, then we want to look at, is it being implemented with fidelity? If it's not, then we need better fidelity before we decide, oh, we're not doing this doesn't work. Okay? So that might mean that we need extra training, ongoing coaching, more feedback, all sorts of ways to sort of improve the fidelity. If it is being implemented with fidelity, well then we likely have a non-responder to that intervention. And so that student might need something different. They might need a completely different intervention, or they might need further evaluation to understand the problem better. On the other side, if the data indicate the student is responding, and the intervention is not being implemented with fidelity, I don't even know what to tell you about that, okay? Likely what it means is there's probably something going on outside of that child's life that is making an impact, right? Maybe they made the basketball team and all of a sudden they realize, oh, I gotta behave and I gotta get good grades in order to be eligible, okay? It has nothing to do with that check-in, check-out intervention. So on the flip side of that, kids responding, the intervention is being implemented with fidelity, well, we're going to not just quit. We're going to keep implementing for this responder, but we might begin to fade that intervention. So that's why I think the fidelity piece is so important. Now, within the TFI does not get at individual intervention implementation. It's a global measure sort of the systems and practices, but we don't have forms within the TFI that evaluate the core components of check-in, check-out, or the core components of social skills instruction. And so that's where the Tier 2 team comes in and has to really create those forms and figure out a way to measure those practices. I think I made it just in the nick of time. I might even be over. I think I'm getting the head nod back there. But here's the point. We're back to circles. Yay, we're going to end on circles, not triangles. Those Tier 1 circles also apply to Tier 2, so it's not just about the practices. It's about the systems that support the practices and the data that we use to make really good decisions. I know we're out of time. I want to leave time for questions. Here are our email addresses. We're both fairly good at responding to email. If you don't get it the first time, prompt us again and we'll email you. So everybody got that. And then we would like to remind you to complete the session evaluation if you get a chance. I can stick around a little bit to answer questions. I know Tim has to run, But thank you so much for being here and being such an attentive audience. We really appreciate it.